For the Russia-Africa summit slated for July in St Petersburg, some 40 African delegates traveled to Moscow in March to discuss cooperation and the influence of the former colonial nations. At the next summit, they will focus on infrastructure, technology and energy projects. Last month, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov slammed Washington for its attempts to derail Russia's engagements with African countries as part of its plan to isolate Moscow. So what are the prospects for the summit following the current diplomatic spat in South Africa? Well, Frontline Group CEO Dr. Jason Musyoka joins us now to help us answer that question. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this morning. How would you characterize Russia-Africa relations?
So thank you so much, Dudu, for having me. So the very interesting emergence of these kinds of alliances and relations are certainly very interesting. And as far as South Africa and Russia is concerned, as we know, the history goes way back, not just political, but also economic and educational alliances, where South Africans have really gone to Russia for education and so on. So the roots and the relations between the two countries are very deep. But U.S. is also a very consequential trade partner as far as economics is concerned between South Africa and the U.S. And so it is a tension at the moment that's going on between how you, on one side, manage the emergence of trade and continuation of trade with the U.S., but at the same time not alienating the relations with Russia. And I think that's a delicate balance that we are dealing with at the moment. And that's really is the context of the current tensions that you see.
How should we understand this tagline of trade? Do countries on the continent come to any party with nothing on the table?
So I think that there is a system referred in World Trade Organization as a generalized system of preferences, GSP, and what that really means is that the much more stronger economic powers should be able to allow much smaller economies or emerging economies to trade with them and to even provide preferential trade conditions without reciprocating. And that is fair to try and equalize the scales on a global level. But that being said, there has been an emerging voice from the African Union itself. I think President Paul Kagame in Rwanda has been very vocal. In Ghana, we've heard voices in Kenya as well. And certainly in South Africa has been also very vocal, suggesting that there should be a reasonable balance of even the negotiations themselves. So Africans don't really, or African leaders don't want to go to the table with nothing. So that has been an ongoing debate. We are not there yet in my assessment of the trade relations between Africa and the West and even with the East. But I think there is an emerging recognition that this trend of aid and going to the table with a begging bowl should not really continue. I think that's increasingly being visible at the moment.
Of particular interest to people on the continent would be the development of her people. And so when we take a look at things like the African Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, how much work is being done to bolster that? While we appreciate that we have to do a balancing act and trade with everybody else, intra-Africa trade is at embarrassingly low levels.
Indeed, and I think that is one of the undoing of the continent. I think that as much as there are ongoing debates between China's presence in Africa and the U.S. trying to contain China's influence and so on, there is a clear lack of regional bloc integration within the continent itself. There are actually two levels of integration that we are seeing a very weak integration. The one is the regional blocs themselves. You have SADC, you have ECOWAS, you have ES, East African Community, and then you have the Northern Bloc as well. In the countries that form those regional blocs are not themselves deeply integrated. East African Community seems to be advancing significantly, in fact moving towards establishing a single currency. SADC, there are still debates in terms of the cultural ties. SADC is perhaps the most integrated, but economically not just yet. So you do see some of those blind spots, so to speak, of the regional blocs themselves. And then now you have the failure of integration on a continental level, where these regional blocs then need to network and remove your trade tariffs and all the barriers that hinder increased trade in the continent. So I think that is a lot of work that is required. I know the African Union Agenda 2063 aims to progressively achieve that, but I think any serious analysis will suggest that 2063 is too far. That really is another generation. And I think that the goalpost should really be much closer to try and integrate and build a regional, a continental economy much faster than that.
Because you've also got China with the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So we are still talking about AfCFTA, whereas perhaps some suggest that we need to be moving at a much more serious pace. You speak of Agenda 2063, and you rightfully mentioned some sectors of society or some people on the continent have resigned themselves to the idea that they may not see change in their generation, not in the next generation, not even in the 2063 generation. And so with that kind of outlook, you've also got people who are arguing that, well, why is it that you've got some over 40 heads of state flying all the way out of the continent to meet with one man, be it the United States, be it Russia, be it China?
Yes, so I think in that you are seeing a remaking of the international order to perhaps look at the emergence of BRICS, and South Africa has been very vocal, in fact, from 2011 within BRICS itself, and even pre-BRICS you had the IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa as well, forming alliances. So South Africa has really been pushing for alliances of the global south, and of course now being admitted to BRICS in 2010 and continuing, you have seen much stronger voice of the global south. That being said, it's of course interesting that South Africa, vocal as it has been on pushing forward the BRICS agenda. And by the way, the BRICS agenda seeks not just to change the international political economy or balancing of the current asymmetry of global power, but also to finance it, which is why we're talking about a de-dollarization system. We're talking about international bank for the BRICS. So the financing of it is very critical of development in global south. But what we again have seen in my assessment around the continent is the beginning of pushback and recreating an international order that locates the continent within the central discussions around this kind of development, global development issues. But that being said, the point that you've just mentioned, which I think is very critical, is that even the leaders, the current African leaders, most of them will not be alive in 2063. So the kicking the can down the road, I think is another missed opportunity, because then you're going to have China coming in a big way in the continent, and others. Russia is, talking about the Russia-African Summit, and then the African member states themselves without really pushing forward their agenda in their own terms. I think that's a concern that we should have.
Speak of pushing the agenda in their own terms. It was the president of the East African nation of Kenya, William Ruto, who was in conversation with Mo Ibrahim, and he brought up the issue more pointedly of the funding of the African Union, bemoaning countries that do not pay their way in terms of boosting the African Union from a funding perspective, where it is an independent body, whereas it's being funded, we understand, over 60% of the African Union's funding coming from the European Union, which begs the question, what then is on the agenda? Who do you advocate for when you speak of pushing the agenda of the continent on the part of leaders of this continent?
I think on that, and that's again a very useful discussion and conversation that really needs to be pushed forward in the continent. And what we are seeing, of course, as you rightly mentioned, you have the U.S. funding the African Development Bank. That essentially really means that you have very limited voice. As a matter of fact, the appointment of the African Development Bank president there was threat of veto from the U.S. itself. And it is some of those asymmetries and hidden alliances that are very monetary and economic that ultimately determine future policies of the continent and so on. But I think that being said, because the world order is changing, the post-World War order post-Cold War World War order is changing significantly, and China emerging as the new empire. The tendency has been to try and find where African Union really needs to find stronger alliances. And I think I would perhaps in my assessment suggest that the movement towards the East and the refusal to, even in February, by the way, we saw that there was a abstaining of voting against Russia by about 15 member states in the continent. That is a good start to begin to read the signs on the wall, so to speak, and look at where the alliances in the future are likely to benefit the continent. And I think China is almost non-negotiable, that it is going to be the next world superpower, and how we forge alliances is important. But let me add one more thing, Dudu, it's that there need to be also a lot of caution and concern that even though China is the emerging global economic power, there need to be a lot of care and concern that we don't end up in another colonial recycling or a deja vu of what we've had with the U.S.-led global world order. That needs to be much more nuanced, the relations between Africa and the East. And I think that leaders need to be initially, of course, theorizing that and engaging in conversations, and then implementing development policies that are not punitive and that don't end up with a race to the bottom for the continent.
What then do you say to somebody that says, well, Prof, too little, too late? We're already seeing that in some countries where China comes in, they build, they develop. Also, there's a conversation about Africa's debt sustainability, right, where countries will then come in the name of infrastructure development. If you're not able to pay back that money, they take pieces of that country.
That's one of the real dangers that we've said, that if you're not very careful, we will end up with the same deja vu that I mentioned earlier, because again, Ghana is already in a debt trap. Kenya is heading there if nothing seriously is done. And several other countries that are really trapped. And keep in mind that these debt traps that we're talking about are tethered on the economic relations or trade relations with China, which is lending of a lot of money which countries are not able to afford to pay back. And I think this should be a red flag as far as forging alliances with the emerging superpower is concerned, and ensuring that leaders are responsible for their own development. Ultimately, development has to be national. It has to be funded largely on a national level, whether through taxes or revenue or other kind of innovative mechanisms. But to kind of go towards the same route that we've seen since the 1960s as far as the relations with the U.S. is concerned, there's a lot written about how aid, it's not just that aid has not delivered development. There's a lot written about how aid has actually created underdevelopment and perpetuated it. And you want to avoid that with the new emerging power. Otherwise, we are going to have this kind of recycling of poverty and poverty traps. And by 2063, we will still be talking about Africa's underdevelopment and youth unemployment and so on. I think leaders need to be more innovative, not just politically vocal, but seriously pushing forward development agenda that is grounded, that is funded largely by the continent itself.
Silencing the guns. At one point, that was a theme of the African Union. And then in 2023, you find yourself recently, there were some South Africans who were coming back home. A young woman came back home from Sudan with just her toiletry bag. Whereas she left the country with a number of bags. Your heart bleeds when you look at that there's so many opportunities on this continent, and the minute you find them, that country then gets destabilized, because security is also a big issue on this continent. You take a look at what's happening in West Africa, in the Sahel, you've got the situation in Sudan, and that's just to mention but a few. And so what do prospects because this conversation is null and void if we're not able to get a handle on the security situation. It boggles the mind that in 2023, Africa is still burning.
Yeah, so a very serious concern around security in the continent. And I think that when the African Union, which is was formerly the Organization of African Unity, OAU, it was intended at stabilizing security around the continent, because that was the most pressing challenge. As a matter of fact, in between 1960 and about 2000, there were more than 18 coup d'etats in the continent. And so security was a major issue on the agenda of the Organization of African Unity. It has continued because the roots of this kind of ethnic conflicts or tribal conflicts, they are there and they have not really been done away with. That being said, it's very critical for the African Union is not a very powerful organization, unfortunately. The power rests on largely the member states. And that perhaps is something that leaders need to look at, how to empower the African Union itself as a continental body to try and deal with, and not to have, when you see these kinds of conflicts, including in Western Sahara, you see the fragmentation with the Western states raising one particular voice and Eastern groups raising a different voice. So the convergence of the Union, the African Union itself, and the empowerment is very critical to, number one, maintain security, and then, of course, proceeding from that is a lot of literature and research done around the links between democracy and development. And if you don't have any stable state, you're unlikely to achieve development. That is, I think, something that need to be looked at, maintaining security at the same time as a conducive environment for investment and for development.
Frontline Group CEO, Dr. Jason Musyoka, thank you very much for your time. Rachel Makura is standing by with all things sport.